Thanks, Cian Corla. Yeah. Boris Johnson is a wrecker, and his internal market bill and the talk of breaching international agreements and resurrecting the threat of a hard Brexit, with obviously the possibility then of resurrecting fears which must be resisted every inch of the way of hard borders and so on, but even just more generally the economic damage that would be done as a result of a no deal, the advent of tariffs, customs and so on an east-west basis, all of which will do very severe economic damage to particular sectors of the economy, and as Deputy Barry said, to working people, most importantly, working people north and south, and indeed in Britain. That's par for the course, really, for Boris Johnson to behave in that sort of reckless way. And in that context, obviously, the broad thrust of this bill is something that we support, which is about trying to maintain as much as possible the status quo in terms of the common travel area, arrangements in terms of health services and cooperation on health on a north-south basis, social welfare arrangements, immigration arrangements and so on, to minimise the disruption and ensure those rights, as Deputy Barry mentioned, are maintained as much as is possible. So in broad terms, we would obviously support that. I do think, though, in terms of some aspects of the bill, and it's a big bill and there's a lot in it, that I do find some aspects of it sort of interesting and noteworthy. While in broad terms the ambition to maintain the status quo is absolutely correct, it is interesting in the way in which the bill, because it has to cover so many different areas, highlights certain aspects of the status quo in terms of the tax system particularly, and corporate tax reliefs, which which are not so wonderful. I mean, I refer to, and maybe in his response the Minister will come back on that, but I was just looking at one example of the, I think it was section 51 of the bill, where it refers to an anti-avoidance, corporate tax avoidance measure in section 130 of the Taxes and Consolidation Act, which seeks to recharacterise interest as a distribution in certain circumstances. Now, that's a good measure in that interest being paid by one company to another one of its own subsidiaries is one of the main mechanisms through which companies, many of whom are based here but have operations elsewhere in the European Union, actually avoid tax. Because if you're paying interest, it's considered a cost, therefore you get tax relief on it. But actually, as this section rightly sort of identifies, often those so-called interest payments are in fact distributions. They're distributions of profits in reality. But that characterization, the recharacterization, the correct recharacterization of interest payments as actually being distributions only applies, it seems, to countries outside the European Union. So within the European Union, you can fiddle your taxes by calling your profits interest, but if you're outside the European Union, you're restricted from doing that. When in fact you should be restricted from doing it whether you're inside or outside the European Union. You shouldn't be able to fiddle your taxes by characterising profits as actually interest repayments, as costs. And this is a very significant mechanism through which bigger companies with subsidiaries in multiple jurisdictions evade tax. We had, one of the companies owned by, I think, Mr. Goodman, who had his operations operating in Luxembourg, for example. This is one of the mechanisms through which they reduce their tax bill. But many of the others do the same. So I just thought that's interesting. And now Britain, notwithstanding, the wrecking ball of Boris Johnson, the possibility of a hard border, this bill has to make sure that Britain will still be included, effectively seen as a member of the European Union, for the purposes of continuing to facilitate a form of tax avoidance. And I just think that's interesting. And in fact, that section on corporation tax is revealing in that all of these myriad of tax loopholes which benefit big corporations in order to reduce their tax bill for the purposes of whatever about Brexit, Britain is still going to be included in that loop for facilitating tax avoidance. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think we should single out Britain for the reasons that, that this bill is broadly trying to address, which is to maintain the status quo. But I do just think it's interesting that the status quo also includes a myriad of tax loopholes that it seems it's absolutely essential that we continue to maintain those tax loopholes that actually allow corporations that should be paying a much bigger contribution in tax to actually pay that contribution in tax. So I say that is noteworthy. But on the broader thrust of it, I would just say to Minister Coveney and to the government, we have to do everything to ensure that the Boris Johnson wrecking ball doesn't succeed. And under no circumstances, whatever may happen, must we allow any of his actions or pressure from the European Union in order to protect the single market from Boris Johnson's race to the bottom to result in any talk of re-establishing a hard border. That is simply can't be allowed. And while I welcome President-elect Joe Biden's, comments in relation to not doing trade deals with Britain if it does anything to endanger the peace agreement in the north, or to break international agreements, or to endanger the peace or the reinstallation of the border. I do share and echo some of the comments that Deputy Barry made also. Don't put too much trust in Joe Biden. I mean, we're all so relieved to get rid of Donald Trump and the toxic politics and agenda of hate and division that he represents. And of course, he was an ally to Boris Johnson. But I don't think we should be under any illusions that Joe Biden and the Democrats are somehow necessarily going to be stalwarts when it comes to preventing the sort of neoliberal agenda that Boris Johnson actually represents, because they, to a very large extent, Joe Biden in particular, and the mainstream of the Democratic Party, are people who have facilitated and encouraged neoliberalism, the race to the bottom, and so on, at the expense of working people, and to a very significant extent, indeed, their failures to protect working people in the United States, and their essentially facilitation of a corporate agenda created the conditions for the rise of the rotten and toxic politics of Trump in the first place. So I'd be cautious about putting too much hope and dependence on Joe Biden. And I hear Sinn Féin also saying that I think such illusions in Joe Biden would be somewhat misguided. But I'll just conclude in saying, given that Johnson is such a wrecker and has been exposed as such, and that he's similarly been exposed for his incompetence and failure in terms of COVID-19, and you can see that playing out with the mess, frankly, and the Northern Executive have to share some culpability as well in terms of the failure to recognise the need to be coordinated with the South in terms of an all-Ireland strategy and maintaining the restrictions rather than talking of lifting them on Friday. The time has never been better to make the case for a united Ireland. When you look at what Johnson represents, the mess he has made in Britain at every single level, and indeed how the politics of the DUP, of Johnson and so on are threatening public health on this island and the ability of people to deal with the existential health threat that is COVID-19. So now is the time to make the case for a united Ireland, but it has to be a different type of united Ireland that genuinely offers a better future, real equality for working people and to end the politics of sectarianism and division.
Thank you, Deputy.